All right,
Yeah.
let's see what happens.
Got it.
It even says it's okay. Well, we'll find out. Hopefully, after the when I say stop, it'll ask me what I want to do with the recording. All righty. So to get started, so you've all seen the handout. Okay, so first thing to start with is philosophy of religion is kind of a Christian conspiracy. In that it's as a discipline in philosophy, it arrives in kind of a circuitous route to sort of regular mainstream academic philosophy, which is that it starts out primarily as an apologetic exercise, and apologetic from the ancient Latin meaning of attempting to justify something. So Christian apologetics. So philosophy of religion starts out as philosophical arguments inside Christianity. And so a lot of the focus in the arguments has been in sort of Christian thought, but they're attempting to make broader arguments. And so that's sort of the way philosophy of religion was in the early modern period. Now, get into sort of probably post World War II, especially, and certainly to some degree before that, but definitely after the war, academic philosophy takes a hold of it as a topic that it can deal with as part of dealing with all of the other kinds of things it wants to deal with. And after that, there becomes a possibility, although it takes some time before people really start exploring it too much, but a possibility of treating philosophy of religion as in sort of a literal sense of the words, philosophy of religion in the sense of what the hell is religion? The way philosophy of biology asks, well, what is biology and how does it work and what does it study? And so philosophy of religion has this path where in the secular philosophy, it can ask that kind of question, although historically that question has usually been asked by social scientists. So much more common to find that kind of, like I even wrote a book with that title, What is Religion? That was the title of my dissertation. And I was doing it as a philosopher of religion, asking that question, but to answer the question, you have to go to the social sciences. So it tends to be something that shows up in religious studies more than it would in a theology department, or the way it actually works in the names. The schools that have departments that are called religious studies, those are social science departments that study anthropology and sociology, and they might include looking at some philosophy and theology along the way, but their primary interest is social science. If you encounter a university that has a department that calls itself religion, that's a humanities department that studies primarily philosophy and theology. So religion, and that was actually my PhD was in a religion department. My master's was in a religious studies department. So I've had experience with kind of both of these approaches, which is why I was use the religious studies approach in my religion PhD. Anyway, so what you might notice, right, is that if you look at the topics on the sheet, the question, what is religion, did not come up. And that's why it doesn't come up, is because historically that's not actually the question that philosophy of religion was asking. And since my job here is to teach you about all the big names in the history of the field, we have to cover all of that old stuff, because the new stuff it's too new. It wouldn't come up at a cocktail party unless you were hanging out with a bunch of theologians. So at any rate, what we're doing here then primarily is looking at arguments that primarily Christian thinkers have made about ideas that are important to Christian theology. And so in particular, that's going to be, can I prove God? And then there's one whole side of philosophy that follows Immanuel Kant that just says this attempt to prove the existence of God is just utter nonsense. I don't know what the hell you people think you're doing. So there's also that. So there are very serious believers like Kant, very serious believer, who still look at this whole project and think that it's nonsense. But to some people, so it's still a hot field. These arguments still get retooled. There are more and more modern versions of these arguments. What I'm going to teach you are sort of the classic, the most famous examples of each of these arguments. But they all have older arguments that go back to the ancient Greeks, and they all have modern incarnations that are being published today. So it's what we're looking at are just the most famous version then. Okay, so, but it does start actually with something that the Christians sort of encountered by accident and then had to deal with, which is this bit from Plato we call the Euthyphro dilemma. So Euthyphro is a young disciple of Socrates in the dialogues. Welcome, Aaron. And they're having a larger conversation about the nature of good, what is goodness. And Plato is going to use the argument as a way of explaining and arguing for his theory of the forms that we talked about. But along the way, there's this brief little two-line exchange that Socrates has with Euthyphro that we call Euthyphro's dilemma, because it seems to present an important logical puzzle, especially if you're interested in a God that has any interest in people. I mean, there's one version of arguing a theology that the God is just this principle of creation, and so it doesn't have any interest in humans, and that sort of doesn't count. But if God has an interest in humans, this sort of becomes important. So the dilemma, right, is, do the gods love good action? Or sometimes they'll just say the good. Do the gods love the good because it is good? Or is good action good because it is loved by the gods? And what he's getting at there is good an independent evaluation? Is good independent of God somehow? So, and if that's the case, then human beings should be able to reason their way to the good. So we can understand right and wrong because right and wrong have some sort of rational component that we can understand. God also, as a rational creature, understands, and so God loves the good and we can love the good because that's rational. The problem with that, right, is that if we can understand the good through rational exploration or experimentation or whatever, any tool, but if humans can understand the good, then there is no need for God to tell people what's good. So God becomes kind of irrelevant. Why do you need God then? If the other end of the dilemma, if the gods love the good because God defines it as good, in which that means anything God happened to define as good would have to be good, regardless of our opinion of it. And in that case, God is inexplicable and a dictator. So that's the dilemma that's Euthyphro's dilemma. It's like, well, oh, you mean God is irrelevant? Or God is this weird dictator we can't understand? And that seems to make God irrelevant either way you go in the dilemma. Okay, Joanne.
Richard,
yeah.
Do they ever talk about how do they know what God knows?
Well, okay, yes, and that's a problem of epistemology, as a matter of fact, in religion. You know, how do you know? You know, the obvious answers are references to scripture, and there are their own problems to ask about how do you trace that, and how do you know that what's scripture and what's not scripture. I mean, it's fraught with problems. But
what about the ancient Greeks, though? I mean, what about Plato?
They would, it's the same thing. It'd be they'd know it because they know the stories about the God.
Oh, okay.
So just different scripture in that sense.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't call it scripture, but you know, for analogy here.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, so this is this is where the Greek world just causes some trouble. It's not earth-shattering, I guess, is sort of the way to put it. When we get to the problem of evil is earth-shattering. But Euthyphro's dilemma, it generally doesn't get a lot of popular attention in ordinary culture. So it's not something that attracts much worry on the part of philosophers or theologians who would feel the need to defend against it. But it's just one of those little things out there that people who are educated in religion are aware is an issue, that at some point someone should be thinking about this kind of thing. So Euthyphro dilemma. Any questions about that? Okay, not a big deal. So in the history of these kinds of debates, then going on to the arguments about God, there are, when I do like a philosophy of religion class, there's like a top 10 of these proofs that one could go through, but these three are far and away the most common that get discussed at any level, whether that's popular culture or scholarly literature. These are the three that far and away get much more attention than any of the others. So ontological argument. Ontos is from, I think that's going to be, this is all Latin. Ontos means being. And so ontology then would mean the study of being, sort of what is, and that's tucked into metaphysics as a subject, right? So metaphysics is asking, well, what's really real, and then asking, well, what exists, what does it mean to exist? That's sort of a sub part of asking that question about what is reality. So being, what is being? So it's then he's going to have in mind, or this would have in mind, sort of the being of sort of the universe itself. So anyway, okay, let me just go through it here since we have it on the sheet. So it is a conceptual, and this is from, so Anselm of, I guess I should start up with that. Anselm of Canterbury was a monk, and in this period, sort of deep in the Middle Ages of the year 1000, he's born 1033, dies 1199. It's a period of time when we call scholasticism in the history of philosophy, and the church thinkers, and and most education in Europe is happening inside church structures. So it's the educated in the population are churchly educated, and they're starting to take an interest in more mathematics and logic, and wanting to starting to sort of push limits on some knowledge, and then here this would involve trying to use logic in a way that is making advances on knowledge, that I'm going to prove something because I can use logic to prove it. And that wasn't quite the way that the ancients would argue. Plato will have justifications for his ideas, and at times he'll have something that looks like an argument. Aristotle is much more likely to have something that looks like an argument, but they would rely a lot more on examples, and would use analogies as they would rely on analogies as their primary argumentation, as opposed to logic as their primary argumentation. So the ancient world has a different way of trying to justify itself and its ideas than the Middle Ages has, and Anselm is really the kind of the figure who stands out in the earliest period of these changes to arguing for something that's more logic based. So he writes, it's a conceptual truth, or so to speak, true by definition, that God is a being than which none greater can be imagined. That is the greatest possible being that can be imagined. So that becomes a premise in the argument. So God is that which nothing greater can be conceived. So then he's going to derive from that the idea, well, then that means that God exists as an idea in my mind. So if I have an idea of God as the greatest possible being, then we start with acknowledging, well, that idea is in my head. A being that exists as an idea in the mind and in reality is, other things being equal, greater than a being that exists only as an idea in the mind. So if God exists only in my mind, then God isn't really the greatest being, greater than none which could be conceived, because I could conceive of God existing in the real world, and that would be greater than God existing only in my head. So it would be the case that God existing in the world would be a greater than God existing only in the mind of someone or many people. Thus, if God exists only as an idea in the mind, then we could imagine something that is greater than God, that is a greatest possible being that does exist. This is what I was just saying. But we cannot imagine something that is greater than God, for it is a contradiction to suppose that we can imagine a being greater than the greatest possible being that can be imagined. So he's just sort of acknowledging that, doubling down on the greatest. Therefore, God exists. Aha. Okay, so yeah, not everybody finds this compelling, but it's an interesting run at an idea. So, and what he's ultimately relying on, I think, or what people have often said, looking at this over time, is that it seems like there's kind of a psychological argument that's being made underneath all of this, which is, yes, you have an idea about God in your head, and it's important that God is real, and that if that's how you think of God as the greatest, then you should think of God as real, and that's going to make more psychological sense for you. And the argument is just for the intellectuals to justify all of that. Being, though, so nature of being. The modern incarnation of this will we'll try to get at there aren't good reasons for people to have that kind of an idea of God in their head without there actually being a God that would reflect that idea in their head. So it gets the logical bit sort of gets hard, but there are psychological attempts in there, like, so the idea has a source kind of thing. So once you have the idea, which actually slips into some of the other arguments just conceptually. Okay, so Anselm of Canterbury, ontological arguments, ontological about being, so greatest possible being. That's how all that fits together. Ontological argument about God being great. How's that with everyone? Okay, this one's definitely the most abstract of the three, and they actually their significance in the world is increasing as we go along here. So this is the least, and then cosmological is going to be the next, and teleological will be the one that gets the most attention. Okay, so Thomas Aquinas, you may have heard of, saint in the Catholic Church. Aquinas is sort of being that, a couple hundred years after Anselm, this logical move and the use of this kind of move in argumentation has been reinforced over and over again. So by the time we get to Aquinas, it's pretty well established. And there is some progress that's been made in geometry, and so the way that geometry makes arguments starts to become important, and starts to get referenced in how arguments are made in this period in the Middle Ages. And also very important for Aquinas is that Aristotle had been rediscovered shortly before Aquinas's lifetime, and which is kind of a surprise. I think if you didn't know this, you wouldn't. It's not something people would expect, but as it happens, Aristotle got lost in history for a while, for about 1,000 years, and it's because his popularity in Greece had been eclipsed by some followers of Plato, and particularly the school that this guy Plotinus starts, which we call Neoplatonism. So when Plato and Aristotle were both alive, there are other kinds of teachers and other kinds of schools in the Greek world that they're competing with. Plato's school he calls the Academy. Aristotle founds a school after attending the Academy and eventually deciding and coming to the opinion that he has a break with Plato's thinking that we talked about. And Aristotle started his own school called the Lyceum. So the Academy existed for a number of centuries. I think it might even be 7, but anyway, so it exists for a number of centuries. The Lyceum, not nearly as long. So when the Lyceum fades in influence, Aristotle's influence fades, and people just seem to stop talking about him. And the places where his work would have been stored in libraries, they get sacked, they get burned down, they get flooded, and so they're just places where his work could have existed, but it disappears because of the accidents of history and natural disasters. But there was one, there was a library in Alexandria in Egypt that was the greatest library in history at one point, was started by the Romans. And that library had been burned down during the fall of the Roman Empire. And so in the 12th century, early 12th century, there were are 2 origin stories here. I'll tell you one of them. So we don't know for sure, but this is one of the stories. 12th century, there are some Islamic scholars doing what we now call archaeology in the ruins of the Library of Alexandria, and they discover some scrolls that had somehow survived the fire and the weather of all of that 1,000 years. And they look through these scrolls and discover this Greek that they don't, from someone they've never heard of. And they have to track down some Greek scholars, and they start translating it, and they start to realize that, well, here's this very important philosopher who was a contemporary of Plato's that we didn't know about. And they dig more, they find more, and they find some more, and they find some more. And over time, it becomes clear that they have found a lot of stuff, but they've probably only found half of what existed, because Aristotle makes references to his own work occasionally. And so following those references, they can sort of figure out, okay, half of the things he talks about, we don't know about. So we know that much about Aristotle, that half of his work is still lost in history. But the discovery of Aristotle is very, very exciting. And so the Muslims translate as much as they can into Arabic, and that makes a really big impression in Arabic philosophy. It gets translated into Hebrew and makes a huge impression in Jewish theology, and gets translated into Latin and makes a big impression in Catholic theology, and especially in the person of Aquinas here, the doctor of the church. And so Aquinas is very enamored of the power of Aristotle. And in fact, in his work, whenever he's referencing arguments that Aristotle makes, he just simply refers to Aristotle as the philosopher. So the philosopher says. So, and he does the same thing with Paul. He calls Paul the prophet. And so a lot of Aquinas is the prophet says and the philosopher says, and he's going to combine the two. And Aquinas in his work actually offers 5 of the famous proofs for the existence of God. It is the cosmological one, for some reason, that people refer back to Aquinas over and over again. So he becomes the person who's most associated with the cosmological argument, even though he has his own version of all of the others. But I think there's a version of the cosmological argument that comes out of Islam that's called Kalam, K-A-L-A-A-M, Kalam, which is very close to the one that Aquinas is making. So it's an argument that was made sort of throughout the Islamic Empire and throughout the Catholic world as well. Okay, so cosmological argument here just based on the word cosmos, and these names are meant to be helpful. So ontological argument, ontos, being, about God's being. Cosmological argument, cosmos, it's about the nature of the cosmos. So his is even simpler than Anselm's, right? Whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. This appeals to some deep human intuitions about things don't just appear out of thin air. They need to be created somehow. Everything we have around us was made by something. So there is a creator. There is a creator involved. The hard part here is the first premise. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now, it seems like it should fit our intuitions, but do we know that that's really true? And it turns out in quantum theory, it's not true. Things can just appear out of nowhere. It's part of what the physics has discovered, modern physics has discovered about the world. Turns out, it doesn't have a cause we can identify. It just happens. And at least in the quantum world, things just happen. But a lot of theologians, the deep problem with the cosmological argument is that it doesn't help with the kind of God they're interested in. So if you can prove to someone's satisfaction that the universe has a cause, you haven't proven that that cause has any connection to human beings, only the universe itself. So it's a complicated argument that says, well, if there is a Big Bang, then the Big Bang had a cause and we can call that cause God. But that doesn't mean that anything after the Big Bang has anything to do with us. So if you've proven that God exists, all you've proven is that the principle of your first premise works, but it doesn't actually mean anything. So the cosmological argument tends to leave people feeling a little flat. Like, well, okay, what did you prove? Now, there are people still, play with these things and are fascinated by them and try to rework them. The cosmological argument has a newer form that wants to make a deeper shift into logic, and so argues not in terms of first causes, but in terms of necessity. And so the modern argument is that, well, what we call existence in the universe is all contingent, is all at some level fairly accidental, in that it could have been otherwise. Atoms could have gone this way or that way, or collisions could have gone that way or that. It just happens that this is how the universe played itself out. So that's all contingent. Well, but then there is the problem. Well, why should it be if it's just contingent? And so the argument is, well, in order for anything to be, there must be some being, some existence that is necessary. So instead of just arguing that for first cause, the modern version of the cosmological argument argues that there must be a necessary being for there to be a contingent being. Same problem here in terms of making God relevant to human beings, but the even bigger problem of the first premise is still just an assertion. Like, well, why should I believe that just because there is contingent being in the universe, that therefore there must be necessary being in order to kind of carry that contingent being along? I mean, you can say that, but why is that? Why should anyone believe that? So the first premise is really kind of difficult to get off the ground with the modern one. But anyway, still has supporters who play with it. So cosmological argument.
Can I ask one thing?
Yeah.
Of the three types of arguments, number 2 is cosmological and 3 teleological. What was the first one?
Is ontological.
Ontological. Thank you.
Right. So ontos, being, cosmos, the universe, telos. Now that one I actually know is Greek. Oh, Joanna, did you have a question?
Finish your thought.
Well, I'm going to start the next one. So if you.
Oh, okay. So
So
even the first premise, or the premise there, so there's a cause. How do they leap that the cause is God or human-like?
Well, no, that's the problem. Is that you can't. There's nothing in there to lead you to a claim that that whatever you call the creator. In that case, it's just actually a linguistic move. Well, we'll call the creator God, but that doesn't make that God relevant to human beings. It doesn't get that creator into Judaism or Christianity or Islam. It just gets them into the universe as a whole.
Okay, because it could as well be a cause we have not determined yet in physics or science, right?
Well, Aristotle actually has a version of the argument, and in his version, the creator doesn't exist after creation.
Okay. Oh.
that's the little I should actually worth mentioning. So there's a little side problem that Aquinas has there, that when he takes the argument from history, he's taking it from Aristotle, and Aristotle has his version of the argument is that there must be a beginning and there must be an end. And so he says that there must be something that is moved at the beginning but does not itself move. So he calls it an unmoved mover. So in a sort of a chain, you think about a chain of dominoes, right? So there's a first domino that is not knocked over by another domino. Something else has to knock it over. And there is a last domino that does not knock over another domino. So what he's saying is there must be a first domino and something must push the first domino, but that doesn't mean the thing is still there anymore. It just pushed the first domino and it's done. And then there must be a last domino.
Okay.
Those stand as just brute assertions that have to be justified. There's not. Aristotle has a reason that is intuitive in his logic that, oh, these things must be true, but it's just an intuition in the way that he thinks. It's not actually. There's nothing in science that tells us that has to be true. Okay, so unmoved mover. That's actually worth remembering that relates to this argument. What Aristotle calls unmoved mover. That's Aristotle's God. Okay, so Bill had a question.
So I was going to ask, maybe you've already answered. What's the cause of God?
So as it happens, then that's Kant's critique of the arguments is well, just because you've explained something doesn't mean you've proven that we can't ask the question again, what caused that? So Kant's critique of and he actually will lay it out against all of them, is that they all are just this weird infinite regress, because there's no reason why you can't why you have to stop asking the question at one point. You can keep asking it. That was good though, but you came up with that on your own. That's good. That's good. Yeah. Okay. Anyone else before we go on? Okay, so teleological. Telos is the Greek word for end. And it also is introduced into the history of philosophy very, very powerfully from Aristotle. It's a deep part of Aristotle's thinking. And again, it's not something that he's able to justify in our scientific world, but deep part of his thinking that things have goals. So when in his thinking, right? So there, if you take an acorn, it is in the nature of the acorn, in the ontos, the being of the acorn, that it wants to be an oak tree. And so for Aristotle, he says that is the telo, the end state is in the nature of the thing. The acorn, you plant it, it's going to become a tree because it's going to pursue its telos. It is as if there is a kind of force that is pulling the acorn towards becoming a tree. So, and this is where Aristotle's philosophy is still a little, compared to the modern thinking, this is still a bit magical. We don't use this kind of thinking anymore, but it's still intuitive to us in a lot of ways, and so even if we're mistaken. So when people think about the thumb, which is really a common example, they think, well, it does seem like it, it was designed that someone wanted this, right? So how do you get a thumb unless something pulled the design towards a thumb? It just seems like, yeah, so this is what Thomas Paley comes up with. Now, Paley is an English mathematician. He's wandering across the beach one day and has this thought. If I encountered a pocket, now he's imagining a pocket watch, right? So think about fancy Swiss-made pocket watch. I find a pocket watch in the dunes of the beach. I would be struck with the details of how it's made, the tiny gears and intricacy, and it would just scream to me that someone designed, there was an engineer who made this watch. Someone had to come up with a way of making all of these tiny little pieces fit together. So there needed to be a design engineer somewhere making this. And so when I look around the world, he says, I see all of these fancy intricacies, and they sort of scream out for an engineer to have designed them, because where else would it come from? And there's really there's an interesting example that Berkeley, I think, even refers to, which in optics, because remember Berkeley had a side interest in optics, but even in Berkeley's time, had figured out that the lenses in the eyes of fish are different from the lenses of eyes of terrestrial creatures, because the eye of the lens in the fish has to compensate for the refraction that the water is causing. And so for Paley, that kind of example is like, well, someone had, there had to be some genius level intelligence that came up with this kind of thing, right? Where else did the watch come from? So this is called teleological argument, because the designer is pulling, right? The designer is the one pulling the thing into creation. So whoever designed the watch, in some sense, is kind of pulling it into existence. So similarly, fish eyes, they got to be pulled into existence somehow. That's how the world works. And then Darwin came along a couple decades later. Nuts. That all fell apart. It was short-lived. It was powerful, but short-lived. So Paley makes a really big splash because the argument is very compelling to people. It's a, again, remember we talked about this with Plato and analogies. Human beings love analogies. You come up with a good analogy, people follow you to the ends of the earth. So it's a really, really good analogy, this watchmaker. And that's why we even call Paley's version the watchmaker argument. Fits a lot of human intuitions about the world. Problem is, Darwin came along with this scientific explanation about how things get created, and it didn't require a designer anymore. And so then we start looking at the thumb again, and it's like, well, what the hell are we going to do with that? And what biologists came up with is we need a new word. So they call it teleonomy. So the universe as it happens, and especially biology, is filled with examples of teleonomy, which is to say things that look like they were designed for a purpose. Interestingly enough, I heard a real world example of kind of how this this gets misused in nature. Apparently camels evolved in what's now the Arctic, and they were originally snow creatures who had big flat feet to help them walk on the snow, and these humps because they didn't have that much food around, because it's also kind of arid in that part of those climates as well. And it was just over time, as climate changed and camels sort of move around, try to find someplace they can survive, they ended up desert creatures because the evolution, the teleonomy of flat feet in the snow works on sand. And so when we look at the camel, you think, well, the camel is just perfectly evolved to live in the desert. And it just happens, well, not exactly. At least originally, it was evolved somewhere else. But yes, and then it evolves to fit even better. So teleological argument is it's still really popular. I mean, this is why right-wing religious forces are so intent on challenging evolution, is because this argument is sort of the most basic and straightforward. The other two are working with sort of some weird logical intuitions that you have to agree with. This one just fits with very, very basic human intuitions. And so if you can convince people that evolution isn't real, then they're back to the teleological argument as their explanation. But once you have some science, that science just totally disrupts it. So it's powerful either direction, either as a reinforcer or as a disruptor. So
I feel like I haven't heard much about the anti-evolution
in a while,
kind of thing in a while. Yes, that's still really a thing.
It was a bigger thing 30 to 20, 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But they have museums with intelligent design in the South. I mean, that was just created the last, 5-10 years.
Yeah, the one with people riding dinosaurs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it hasn't gone away, really.
But it's true. It's not in the popular culture as much as it was a decade or two ago. Yeah, Helena. Oh, I think you're muted.
I can't sort of escape the thought of telos.
Yeah.
You say that is no longer really in vogue, but to me it speaks very real. I think that things have a goal, but isn't that basically what he says is that we grow into the essence of ourselves?
It's that modern biology sees all of this working as a push and not a pull. And that's kind of the important part for them. So the modern biology would look at the same story with the acorn and say, well, there is the potentiality of the oak is in the genetics of the acorn. And so those genetics will push the acorn to become a tree. It's not that the oak tree is pulling the acorn towards being a tree.
I can't find my thing.
It's in the nature of the acorn itself to push itself in that direction. It's not in the final outcome pulling the acorn towards it.
Somehow it
really-
speaks to me. I don't know, it just speaks to me, the whole picture of
Uh-oh.
it.
Mm,
Crap.
Sorry. You say crap? What's
I kind of
happening?
with Helena here, because not with biology, but with kind of the whole personal growth movement. This idea that
Yeah.
we have a purpose and that our whole lives are
Yeah.
leading us towards a purpose. That seems related.
Yes.
I froze there for a minute. I'm sorry. So I missed
Oh,
that.
I'm sorry, that's why I laughed. But we are trying to find the essence of ourselves in life. And that's
Right.
why it speaks to me, I think.
Mm.
Yeah.
Who am I?
Right. So
Why
there's a
am I
kind of
here?
metaphysical view that wants
Yeah.
to see pulls, and there is a biology view that wants to see push.
Okay.
And there's some the implications of that are very big, even if that difference doesn't seem that big on the surface of it, but it has these really huge implications because something has to pull and something has to push. And what are those things? And the push is really, for science, is really easily located in something like the genetics. And the pull is difficult to locate, so it has to be asserted religiously.
So even when we're trying to improve ourselves, it comes from within us, not from some exterior
Yeah.
pull.
Well, yeah, I mean, when you get into human beings, there might be other complexities you could introduce. I mean, society's going to have ideas that are going to influence what you think about.
Oh,
what you
that's
want to
true.
do, and so that can be a
That's
kind of a
true.
pull. So
Yeah.
it's yeah, this kind of language is really, it comes out of this. It's rooted in biology, so it's most useful there. You get into psychology, and we have all kinds of other influences that do.
Oh, that's true.
Some do pull.
Yeah, that's true.
So, Bill, 90.
I just wanted to add, in the biological, the pull, or excuse me, the push is also the change in the environment. The things happen because of environmental changes. So anyway.
Part of the push.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay. So,
We were at the camel.
that was a surprise to me. All right. Yes.
I just wanted to say one other thing about, the thumb, the example of the thumb and the giraffe neck and all that kind of teleological stuff. What about our knees? They're very poorly designed, and our backs for walking upright. So, that argument kind of falls apart when you look at things that are not actually designed very, very well.
I would
Yeah.
assume we're at the end.
Yeah.
Maybe we're just not at the end yet.
Well, my knees are in bad shape. They could have been designed better.
But people have made that argument.
Better.
Yeah, if you're going to argue an intelligent designer, why are knees so poorly designed? Yeah.
But maybe we just haven't been fully designed yet. That's what I'm saying. I mean, we have
Uh-oh.
such a propensity to think that as things are now is the highest and best form that they will ever take. And maybe we're on our way to
So I'm recording
having
myself.
things turn into
Watching
better
the
needs,
Frozen
and we're just not there yet.
It's like
I don't think so. We're just bombing everything to bits. So I don't think that's in men's mind.
We're not going to have time to get there.
Right.
Fact.
We're on the way down.
Okay, so next big issue, problem of evil. And so, it is fascinating that we have, the quintessential version of this argument is so ancient, going back all the way to Epicurus. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then God is impotent. Then God is not omnipotent. Is God able but not willing? Then God is malevolent. Is God both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? is he neither able nor willing, then why call him God? It's brilliant. It's brilliant as an argument goes. Sociologically, we know that the one argument that actually changes religious behavior is the problem of evil. That no one has ever gone to church because they encountered a proof for the existence of God and went, I need to start going to church. But there are plenty of examples of people who encounter the problem of evil in some form and they go, I need to stop going to church. Uh-oh. Cat's fighting on my lap. And it's the problem of evil, and the reason this is true is because the problem of evil works personally. My mother grew up in a Mormon family in Utah, and when she was in college, her little brother was drafted and went into the Army and was stationed at an Army Air Corps base in Fairbanks, which ironically later is where my sister was born. But this was a decade and a half before that. His name was Richard too. He's writing he writes these occasional letters home to my grandmother, his mother. And my grandma notices over time that his letters are getting somewhat incoherent and his handwriting is getting very weird. And she calls the base and asks someone to look into this. Oh shit, I'm frozen again, aren't I? My internet connection is really bad today for some reason. Where did I stop?
We can still hear you. I could still hear you.
You could still hear me?
Yeah. But
She
you-
called the base.
Oh, okay. So
Where
she
you
calls
were.
the base. The medical people look into this and eventually discover he has a brain tumor. They fly him to Denver, which is where the biggest Army hospital was at the time. They operate on him and he died in surgery at the age of 23. And for my mother, that was just it. Said, I can't believe any of this anymore. I'm out. So, and that's how the problem of evil usually works, it works personally, individually, one at a time. Somebody encounters something they can't explain, and it's just sort of too awful in their world, and it's, sorry, I'm gone. It, on a bigger level, it works when you deploy it to talk about things like earthquakes and tsunamis and stuff like that. In fact, in the history of Europe, it plays kind of an important cultural role. There was a big earthquake in Lisbon in 1550, 1557. Now I'm forgetting exactly. Anyway, mid 16th century. Lisbon, right, capital of Portugal. Portugal, mid 16th century, powerful world empire. Lisbon, its capital. Earthquake happens on, I think it might have even been Good Friday. Huge earthquake. Chasms open in the ground, seemingly going forever. People fall, buildings fall to their deaths. What they didn't know about, though, was the tsunami that was coming next. Quarter of the population of Lisbon died in a matter of hours. Between the earthquake and the tsunami, quarter of the population is just dead. Lisbon's Catholic. Lisbon's powerful. Like, so what does this mean? And to their imagination, it means God is powerfully mad. Powerfully mad. But it also starts this line of thinking going, which in European history meets its kind of full poetic expression in Voltaire writing Candide. Now, there's a German philosopher named Leipzig who had written an apologia in which he was arguing that this is the best of all possible worlds. And so that becomes a way of kind of defending God against the Lisbon earthquake, because the Lisbon earthquake is going to rattle Europe's consciousness for at least 2 centuries. So this is Leibniz is coming up with this idea. Well, this is the best of all possible worlds, which is his way of saying, okay, sometimes bad things happen we can't understand. But it had to be that way for reasons we can't understand. So this is the best that God could possibly do. So what Voltaire does, right, is he writes this short story Candide, in which he creates this character he calls Dr. Pangloss, who is Leibniz in the play, and then he mercilessly makes fun of him through the course of the play. So Voltaire there is sort of representative of the kind of full Enlightenment engagement of the problem of evil and its acceptance of the negative conclusion that the problem of evil is driving. That's what Voltaire represents. Leibniz is this clinging somehow to a traditional theology, and it's in terms of kind of how theology moves. Popular religion moves much slower, but how theology moves, this is going to create some profound breaks going forward, and really theology is going to make major shifts after this. Is that a question? Oh yeah, Pam, you're muted.
Yeah. Maybe you've already gone past this and I kind of missed it or whatever, but I'm thinking that part of the problem here seems to be that somehow the other gods fell away and there used to be gods who did bad things.
Yeah.
Right. So you could
Yeah.
just point at that God and say, well, this God's wonderful and looks out for me, but this God you can't trust. Right. And then we tried to just pick one and make him, the one who is, compassionate and wise and takes care of us. And then we didn't have any place to put the bad stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, yep. Now, right now, so that becomes a real problem for theology. What's it going to do with that? And a lot of popular thinking will still hold on to these old Manichaean ideas. Manichaean is an ancient idea from the 1st century about good and evil. There's a good God and a bad God, so there's a devil who's responsible for the evil side, and there's a good, so they'll hold on to that even while they're trying to hold on to some of the other theology that came out of the Middle Ages that says that God is omnipotent. And it's like, well, if God is omnipotent, how do you have another power that's contrary? Anyway, but in the popular imagination, you can do that. Intellectuals can't do that. You can't live with that contradiction, but the popular imagination can, and so often does. But academic theology is going to grow a lot out of this experience in some interesting ways. So the argument is especially interesting because the idea that God would be omnipotent is an idea that comes out of the Middle Ages. You have to have mathematics that can deal with infinity, which doesn't happen till the late Middle Ages. But they're moving towards it before, so they start playing with the idea intellectually. But you have to have some framework that makes the concept of infinity comprehensible to start properly using words like omnipotent, because what you're implying then is a universal infinite power, or omniscient. The other word is omnibenevolent. So I think I introduced this language in a previous class. But so the argument from Epicurus is interesting, but one might suppose it didn't get as much attention precisely because of what Pam was just pointing out. They had an alternative explanation for why these bad things were happening. You have to get to some kind of monotheism before the problem is really brought into a stark relief. And of course, well, that's what Christianity and Judaism and Islam do is they move all of this into a monotheistic context. You move into the Middle Ages and you start getting this language of infinity. And so it's there that the problem is really meeting, is really getting really, really important and powerful, because they've accepted these ideas about God, that God is omnipotent, God is omniscient, God is infinitely good, omnibenevolent. So the logic of the argument is that, well, okay, if you start with the notion that God is those things, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient, then God knows what's happening, has the power to influence it, and is intended to good. And so when you combine those three things in the face of tragedy, then the obvious question to ask is, well, what the hell happened? If God has the power to change things, knows what's going on, and intends good things, how do 250,000 people die in one tsunami, which happened in Indonesia in 2012? So there, it's in that the infinity logic that the problem's really meaty and really powerfully problematic, which is why it lands in Europe with such force that you could get something like Voltaire. So what theology is going to do is to abstract a great deal, and it's going to start to move away from omnipotent power, at least at the highest level. So in the world today, in academic theology, the most sort of popular form that theology takes is called process. And process, that word process, comes from this. So Alfred North Whitehead, English mathematician and physicist, becomes philosopher. He was a contemporary of Einstein's and was a contributor, made his own major contributions to quantum theory and relativity. So Whitehead's very, very significant person intellectually. He in his later life becomes interested in philosophy, and he sort of develops this very interesting philosophical explanation for how to relate to a quantum reality. And this is what he calls process. So he has his version of it is very elaborate and relies interestingly on some ideas from Leibniz, which he reworks. But what he creates is a system that is religiously comfortable for theism, scientifically comfortable for quantum theorists, but in doing so, he has to refer to a creator who is not omnipotent. And the reason that's so important is because the problem of evil is turning on three things, like a fire triangle. And if you take away any one of them, you take away the problem. But you can introduce different problems. So you don't want to take away omnibenevolence, because then God is not good. And that's going to be a strange move for theology to make. And it's certainly not very comfortable for religion to try to live with. You could take away omniscience, but that one's going to be kind of difficult to talk about if you're keeping the omnipotence, and that's the only one you're giving up. So God's powerful but doesn't know what's going on. Okay, so God can't really be responsible because God doesn't know what's going on, but that's difficult to kind of live with. If God's omnipotent, how come that power couldn't be deployed in that direction? So what they give up is the omnipotence. So if God is not omnipotent, God can still be all good and all knowing, but lacking the power to actually influence immediate events in the world. And once you make that move, the problem of evil has faded because God's didn't have the power anymore. You can't, it's not somehow God's fault, because if God is omnipotent, it's always somehow God's fault, because God has to either have caused it or allowed it. If God's omnipotent, there's nothing in the universe that can happen in the face of omnipotence that is not willed or allowed by that omnipotence. And that's why the problem of evil exists, is because you have to ask, why would God allow it? Even if you're not arguing God caused it. But if you take away the omnipotence, then you've taken that away too. God doesn't have the power. Now, I had a class with the preeminent pastoral theologian of in-process thought. Her name is Marjorie Suhaki. She's retired now, taught at Claremont Graduate University and the Claremont School of Theology, which is where I did my PhD. So Marjorie, so pastoral theology is how does theology talk to people about their problems and their issues in the world, and sort of or the biggest idea in its seminary is, how do you teach ministers, would-be ministers, how to talk to people about their problems? is the biggest. So that's her job, sort of as a theologian and a professor. How do I teach these would-be ministers how they're going to talk to their congregants about big problems they have in their lives? Pastoral theology. Anyway, so Marjorie Suhaki, she has this interesting example she used in class, because the God that process ends up with is a bit like the computer deep thought in the books Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Do any of you know these books? So in the story, it's set in it's science fiction set in the future, but it's good fun art. Douglas Adams, English comedy writer who's since passed away, but what he imagines is there's this very powerful computer this advanced society has made, and it's so powerful that it was threatening to them, and so they had to destroy it. And in destroying it, they reduced it to particles. But one of the features of this computer is it would be what we call now a quantum computer. Each little piece of it was a model of the whole thing. And so even in its dust state, as dust kind of collected around a planet, it still has a sense of itself and is still able to act in some small ways. And God, process is like that. God is everywhere and can work in small ways. So in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the computer deep thought eventually creates this mock-up of a spaceship, which it causes to crash on a planet for reasons that are interesting and funny in the story. But the important thing is that it created it by in the language that Douglas Adams uses, I think is a nudge of a hydrogen atom there, coaxing a helium atom there, and over a millennia, things can happen, even with small amounts of power, tiny power acting over long stretches of time. So Marjorie gives the example. Okay, there's a little boy playing with a ball in his front yard, and the ball bounces into the street. And the little boy runs out into the street, and there's a car coming down the street. What does God do? Well, God can only nudge. So God can nudge physical things like deep thought could in the story. So God can try to nudge the ball. Okay, if we get the ball to bounce just a little bit that way, maybe disaster could be averted. So God can try to nudge, but there's a little more power in that God can try to speak to the people. The tiny voice of conscience is sort of what Marjorie's imagining, I think. So God can sort of be this tiny voice in the back of their mind, that the driver that says, slow down. Or it says to the boy, don't go there, don't do it. So God's going to use God's influence to try to avert tragedy, but doesn't have the power to actually do it. So very often that tragedy will still happen. But Marjorie's point as a pastoral theologian is that God is omniscient and God is omnibenevolent. And God deeply cares about all of these things happening, and God is watching them happening, and God is there with the people after it happened, trying to comfort them. So process saves God as in a way that people can relate to, but takes away the power that God would be blamed for bad things for. And because it's done through this system that speaks in the language of physics, it becomes very popular in the world today, in educated circles. So university level theology. Yes. Helen, you're muted.
The responsibility of the individual is not necessary then.
No, the individual, in this way, you've actually kept all of that individual responsibility too, because the individuals are deciding. It's not, God doesn't have the power to make God's presence immediately known. And actually, Marjorie's also the feminist theologian who taught me the solution to talking about God as a he or a him, you just don't use pronouns. It's just that easy. So God doesn't have the power to make God's self known in the mind, powerfully present in the mind of the little boy or the driver of the car, only subtly. So they have to act on their own. God can try to be a little bit of an influence, but individuals are still deciding in his system. Individuals still make all their own decisions. I
always feel it's kind of a cop-out, this whole God business.
Well, I'm not a theist either, so
I mean, it's kind of, I know it gives people a lot of comfort, and that's fine, but it's ultimately you're responsible for yourself in this world. And it seems to me it's a cop-out.
Yeah, I know, and I'm sympathetic with that point of view, but along the way, I've also encountered a number of, very powerfully motivated religious people who do good things in the world. And
yeah,
studying theology, there's a lot of theology there's a lot of what theology does that's trying to actually do that, and trying to talk about why we do that, how we go about doing that. So religion definitely cuts both ways in that sense. I mean, it motivates people to do good and to do bad.
Yeah.
Would you spell her last name?
All right, so let's see. I'll go with Pam first.
Yeah, two things. One, when you talk about them getting away from God being all powerful, I always thought that where they retreated to was the idea of free will, which, this idea that he can't make you do anything. You still have a choice in it.
Well,
yes. But I'm wondering what that does when you're talking about natural disasters. I mean, right. How was that helpful when you were talking about the tsunami?
Right. So let me answer that first.
I have another question.
Okay, so there are two versions of the problem of evil. One, the natural problem, one, the human problem. So natural problem, right, very easy with tsunamis. Human problem, cars, holocausts. So, and yes, when you deal with human evil, there has been one popular move to counter the argument, the problem of evil, which is they called the free will defense. Right. So the human problem of evil is countered with the free will defense that, well, God has created people with free will, and therefore people could do bad things. It's generally logically is not so bad, but it tends to be not very compelling to people emotionally. And it's usually problems of scale. So when you're using the problem of evil with, like someone got mugged, that might help them. But if you're trying to talk about why did the Holocaust happen, the problem of evil starts to make God look pretty callous.
Definitely.
And did they do something different with the natural disaster part of it?
Well, the natural one, so it remains a much harder problem to wrestle with as a result.
Yeah.
That you don't have, which is why it was so disruptive for European thought early with Lisbon, is you can't invoke that. They knew the free will, this argument is old, so they knew the free will defense, and it's like,
Okay.
that's not helping me with Lisbon. I mean, you know, people still try to invoke it, like, you know, Jerry Falwell blaming hurricanes on gay people. But
Right.
it's, you know, that's a way of using the free will defense in the context of natural evil. But it's no serious person thinks that, you know, that's childish reasoning for childish thinking.
You talked about the tsunami having had this just, you know, earth-shattering effect on Europe and the whole religious belief system. So what did they, I mean, how did they explain that in their minds? Or did they just not come to any conclusion?
They did try. I mean, there was a version of this free will defense that was used. You know, there were priests who were going through town hanging people who they thought were sinners.
Okay.
On the idea that somehow Lisbon was sinful and that was why God did this. I mean, so I mean that people did go to that and then killed other people to do it, to try and prove
And
it.
it's hard for that not to be kind of considered omnipotent. You
So
do something like that.
So that's why they really didn't, the scale of it really was what was so disruptive. And see,
Yeah.
Europe doesn't have that many, those big earthquakes like that often. So they didn't even know, there's no European history to tsunamis. So they didn't even know to expect a tsunami to happen because there was an earthquake. Where to us, that's no obvious, right? There's an earthquake, there's a tsunami. They didn't even know that. They had no idea. And then the tsunami came. So they're just so blindsided by all of it that there could be an earthquake that big, that there could be this thing we never heard of with this wave. And then so many people die.
And I just wanted to throw in one other thing, you know, we don't have to get into, but I just was wondering about, which is where Satan enters into all this.
Well, that's
was
where
he an after the fact, you know, development to provide a scapegoat?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, in Jewish thought, Shaitan in Hebrew is not evil. Shaitan works for God. So it's a move that's made in later theology, kind of post this movement called Manichaeism that was part of the early Christian world that had this idea about two gods and a creator God who was created the world, which is evil and full of pain, and that's the evil God of the Hebrew Bible. And then there's this good God who's in the Christian Bible. And so Catholic thought will get rid of that, but will eventually kind of keep the idea, well, that evil God could be what the Hebrew Bible called Shaitan. And so then you get Satan as an evil figure. And yes, in popular imagination, it remains useful to have two gods to blame. So they'll keep the idea that there is a powerful devil or Satan as the counterforce to the good, and then that becomes the argument to make. Well, it wasn't God who did it; it was someone else. But that only works if you're not very educated, because once you understand what's being claimed in the omnipotence, in God being omnipotent, then you can't have a second power that's contrary to an omnipotent power. Just logically, that's in the definition of the word that you can't do that. But it's still there. I mean, people will still refer to the devil as doing these things. Okay, we're gonna run out of time. So Bill, Nina.
Bill and Nina had their hands up first, yeah.
Would you spell Marjorie's last name?
Suhaki is S-U-C-H-A-K-I. Suhaki.
I just wanted to say that I think that the nudges from God probably come into the right brain, yes?
Of course. Let's see, what do we got? Okay. Oh, here's one of her books. Church and Grace. Yeah, S-U-C-H-O-C-K-I. Sorry. Her maiden name is Hewitt. So Suhaki's her husband. I forget where he's from. Suhaki's an interesting name. Okay, Pamela.
I was just going to say, when it struck me when you said problem of scale, because that's kind of what I was thinking about. there may be logical reasons that for natural disasters that kind of are human evil or human ignorance, like, you know, pollution and rising sea oceans and whatnot. And I've had a chronic pain thing kind of strike out of the blue. And my husband was like, well, maybe it's just, maybe there's some pollutant or something that with humans we're doing wrong and we just don't know it yet.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, 5 minutes. All right. Real quick. Okay. So once, now the process is a 20th century phenomenon. I should mention, right, because it's dealing with quantum theory. But the movement that's going to start to see power as a problem is going to go back to the Enlightenment and sort of be manifest moving forward. Anyway, so I just don't want to mislead you on that point. That change happens very slowly over time, and it's really not till the 20th century we see the result of it. So it was a developmental thing over time. It didn't happen right away. Anyway, one of the other things that comes up in these arguments, more modern, is an argument that goes between this guy W.K. Clifford and William James. Now, W.K. Clifford was an English mathematician, died from like cholera, which is why you look at his dates and they're not very long, kind of tragic end there. He would have made some really much more interesting contributions if he'd lived longer. So important in mathematics, there are some, I don't know the advanced mathematics enough to appreciate his work, but he did, the mathematicians tell me, he did important stuff. But in philosophy, he has this one essay he wrote, which is very interesting, where he comes to the conclusion, it is always and everywhere wrong to believe on insufficient evidence. And so, it's an interesting argument because the religious people had been making arguments for a long time about mystery and sort of living with mysteries and accepting mysteries and even a sense of virtue in that you're accepting the teachings of the church in spite of the mysteries and all of that. They'll present that as a kind of virtue. Clifford is making this very, very interesting counter or opposite argument that no, that's in fact a form of evil. That if you're believing something and you don't have really good reasons to believe it and you're going to believe it anyway, you're just being irresponsible. Now, to sell this, he has a wonderful analogy, which he'd have to have, right, to be this famous. And he imagines a ship owner who has this ship that hasn't been serviced in quite a while, and he has an important job he needs to do, and he could take the boat out of service. You could take the boat, out of the water and service it, make it seaworthy for sure. But he convinces himself that it's really okay. And so the boat sails and the ship sails and the ship sinks. And when you go back and look at it, and the sinking sort of fundamentally rests on the owner willingly choosing to believe something that he shouldn't have believed. And it led then to these deaths. So it's a very dramatic kind of story to make up to make this point, to construct this analogy. But he sells it pretty powerfully that way, that it's wrong to believe things that you can't prove. And here's an example of how that can manifest in the world. Really bad things happening from someone believing something they can't. So some decades later, because it takes a while for a religious community to respond to this one. This one was really actually pretty devastating in the English-speaking world. It shook people for a while. William James, who has a very famous brother named Henry, who is a novelist. William James was actually one of the founding psychologists in Harvard's psychology department. He was trained in Harvard's philosophy department, but was also interested in psychology. He comes out of a school of thought we call American pragmatism. And pragmatism it's a 20th century American school of thought. And what it does is it tries to make kind of the same move that Descartes' making to just sort of, we're going to do epistemology now and let someone else worry about the metaphysics. In which they want to kind of try to not take a position on the whole materialism, idealism debate that the European philosophers have been having for hundreds of years. And they're going to just worry about things that are kind of more immediately tangible and relevant to human issues and problems, and which is where pragmatism comes from in the name. So James, though, when in his interest in psychology, one of the things that interested him was religious experience. And he actually wrote a very important book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, where he looks at a number of kind of mystical figures in the world and analyzing things that they wrote or said about what they thought was going on. But what he comes up with, and he does this in a lecture that he gave to a religious club at Harvard. But the conclusion becomes, often we do not have sufficient evidence, but we still face choices that are going to force us to make commitments. And what he comes up with is that religious beliefs are very difficult things to get a handle on. And it might be that someone's religious beliefs are not completely justifiable to the outside world, but there's something about it that's justifiable internally to the individual. And what he offers to kind of back that up is some criteria to use. So it's not just what anybody wants to think or say. That if there's something in your experience that's presenting itself very powerfully, he says momentous, there's this momentous thing which is presenting to you the live possibility that you're encountering something divine. And there's something about the situation that's forcing you to think about it, to make some kind of decision about what you think is happening right away. So your decision is somehow momentous, live, and forced. And in that situation, if you have an experience like that, it has those criteria, and it seems to you your only recourse to it is to invoke the divine, then James is saying that's probably a good explanation for you. Now, pragmatism can be frustrating as a philosophy, because that's kind of as far as he's going to go with it. He's not going to say, therefore, other people should believe in God because you do, but he's going to say, well, I see why you do, and that makes sense to me that you do. So it's a clever argument to push back at Clifford, because Clifford's whole point was really to construct a situation that was momentous, live, and forced, but the person's going in the wrong direction with their decision. James is just saying, I can see where someone might be in a situation where this occurs, these criteria arise, and they need to, for psychological reasons, put a story in place that explains their world to them. And this is the story they're going to tell. I can see where that makes sense. But that's all I have to say. I don't have to endorse it. I don't have, but importantly for his audience, the story he's saying, I don't have to argue with them. There's no basis for me to argue with them if this is the claim they're making in the context in which they're making that claim. But I'm not going to use that as evidence in my own life either. So it's not, so again, you sort of see the same move that's happening here, like with process. It's moving in a direction that's wants to value experience, but is going to downplay the power of any claim that's being made. So what you have preserved is the experience. And James then has this comfortable language to help people feel comfortable with those experiences. So he's very popular on that level. Okay, I think I've run over time actually. Any last questions? Oh.
Well, to the last thing, this last argument, I think we need to argue more. We've become complacent in our own beliefs. We need to argue about them and find out things. I'm thankful that I grew up in a very argumentative family where the doors got slammed and the people got mad and then ended up together and played the violin. To me,
I had the same
in
experience.
America, you did?
I did, but I was in a Greek community.
Yeah, we call it, it's called American pragmatism for a reason, right? It's, they don't, if you just called it pragmatism without the American, it wouldn't make as much sense, but it's it is a very American kind of thing that way.
Yeah, yeah. Also, that is also about politics, of course,
Mhm.
you know. But
Yeah,
that
I mean,
also brings the
indeed,
ethics into the room.
We don't, yeah, it's, there's something that's, yeah, Europeans are more direct.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
And they don't make it at least it was never made personal.
Hmm,
You could argue
better at it.
vehemently and then hug and kiss as you went, left the party.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah, that was good.
Okay.
It was a good show. I liked it very much. Learned a lot.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you.
Richard.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll let you go and I'll try to figure out how to do this recording. Stop.